Herding cats. Managing this will probably be far easier than pulling the volume together. All right, let me start with a little history. This book and its predecessor were born, as all good things in Slavic cultures are, in a discussion late at night around the kitchen table, drinking tea or something stronger in the late 90s. And especially people familiar with the region, in 1991, when independence came, everybody said, this isn't going to hold together. All of the boundaries are artificial. There's no sense of nationhood and the like. And it was just about 10 years after that, it was still maybe eight and a half. And with the exception of the nasty civil war in Tajikistan, everything was kind of holding together. And we said, this is interesting. We ought to take a look at why this is the case, look at what's happened in the last 10 years, maybe go out 15 years, 25 years is always a good way of doing this, and see if we can take and put something out for people to get an idea about this area that all of us here, at least on the front table, and hopefully all of you have fallen in love with at one time or another. And if there were books at that time that came out, they were all one chapter on Kazakhstan, one chapter Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan. We decided, as opposed to looking at individual countries, we would take the topics that were important and ask the authors, try and find the best person that we could to write about each of these topics, and then put it together as a way of comparing across the 5 countries. And we actually have, well, aside from here, we have a couple people here. We went out and grabbed Mike Oakes, best person on human rights, Wayne Mary, best person on politics, Dane McKinney, best person on water, Nancy Glubin does drugs. No, that doesn't sound good. You get the idea. So, and we managed to take and pull it together, and in 2004, in The Tracks of Tamerlane, Central Asia's Path to the 21st Century came out. And it was well received because there was nothing like it in the literature. Well, 5 years ago, Terry and I were saying, yeah, Tamerlane was good, but a lot has changed. We probably need to update it. And the idea was to go out, first check with the previous authors, bring in some new people as well, and hopefully have this out in 2 years. 5 years later, remember my comment about herding cats. However, we really at the end felt, and yes, I've got a conflict of interest in this, but we have a fascinating mix of people who are working in the region and dealing with the issues here. And our call was to everybody, write a chapter that you're really interested in, as opposed to telling them what to do. And then credit to Terry for going and being able to pull everything together into one form. So it is not a book to be read cover to cover, though if you want to, I appreciate that. Pick and choose what you find interesting. And hopefully the interest that the authors had in their chapters will also be passed on to you. So we have a number of the authors here today. We're going to just start and work our way down the row and then circle back over here. I've asked each of them to speak 5 minutes on their particular chapter, give you a little flavor. But what's more important after that, we're going to open it up for a free flow discussion. All but one of the important people in this book are up here. I do have to recognize one other individual. He wasn't a contributor in terms of a chapter, but without him, this book never would have come about. Hal, would you please stand up? Hal Timm. If there is a hero of socialist labor in the room, he pulled together, he was the one in contact with the authors. Both Terry and I have our day jobs as well, so we were working late at night. But he was the glue that really pulled this together. So thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
One other We have a couple copies of the book floating around. Also, Lexington left some flyers out there. The bad news is this thing's overpriced. I didn't say that. The good news is that they give a 30% discount if you use the coupon out there. So if you're interested in it, pick it up. I would suggest you get your institutions wherever you work to buy the copy and then borrow it from them. You didn't hear me say that. We're hoping for a paperback copy in the future. But one thing that people sometimes skip over, I'd ask you just to take a look at the dedication if you get a chance. Normally, in the first book, Terry and I dedicated to our families, that's expected. This time around, we dedicated to the scholars that have affected us. And we've both been fortunate to study with some of the great people in the field. So, first of all, this is in recognition of them. And we'll see sometime in the future if somebody dedicates something to one of the authors up here, because they certainly deserve it. Okay, I'm going to stop talking. Sophia, you got 5 minutes.
Thanks, Dan. It's such a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to try to keep this brief. My name is Sophia Srinivasan. I wrote the chapter on foreign direct investment in the oil and gas sector of Turkmenistan. Background on me, I currently work at Standard & Poor's in New York in the global energy infrastructure practice, mostly working on rating unregulated power, utilities, and liquefied natural gas assets. And before that, I was with Deloitte and studied Central Asian affairs at Georgetown. So the chapter that I wrote is about something that I think, and a lot of people think, is the next big thing in the energy sector, and that's natural gas. So what experts predict is that by 2030, natural gas is going to comprise a third of the world's energy supply. And Central Asia, I think, is going to play a really big part in that. In particular, Turkmenistan, because Turkmenistan has the world's 6th largest natural gas reserves. And I think that after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was excitement about whether those reserves could be exploited, which was squelched by the quite authoritarian regime of the first president. But with a new leader in the past decade, there's been some hopes that that would change, that the sector would open up a bit. And I don't think that's happened yet, but instead what's happened is that the country's natural gas and oil sector has really started to become the domain of China. We've seen BP, Chevron, a lot of super majors, big international oil companies try to make their way in, but they haven't been able to. We've had some small companies, not small, but smaller than BP, like Eni in Italy, be able to gain a small foothold there. And then we've seen the China National Petroleum Corporation really make it there. Right now, since in 2016, as you may know, Turkmenistan stopped exporting gas to Russia because of a pricing dispute. China is really their only customer. And this chapter explores why that is the case, why China has done so well, why the supermajors really haven't, and why some smaller companies have been able to get in a little bit. And it explores the history of gas pipelines in the country, of oil and gas, and how it's been developed, and the factors that have enabled and prevented foreign investments. And I think with that, I'll close. I don't want to give it away. Thank you very much.
Little suspense. Read the book. Wow.
Good afternoon. My name is Timm. I'm currently with the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, but prior to that was at the Naval War College, and had spent 30 years in uniform in a variety of positions, including as our defense attaché in Kazakhstan. I was asked to put together a chapter on the security forces and on their role in the region. It was actually a fascinating exercise, and I would characterize it as a study of continuity in the face of change. If we look at the period that we were talking about, the period in which we were thinking about and then working on the book, starting back around 2014, there's an awful lot of dynamism in the region at the strategic, at the political, military level, right? So you are facing an impending, at least at the time, apparent withdrawal of U.S. forces, or at very least a drawdown of U.S. forces in Afghanistan. You have a lot of speculation about declining U.S. interest in the region. You have a rising assertiveness coming out of Moscow. 2014 is, of course, when Moscow's latest disagreement with Ukraine flowers. You see in the next year Russia's first overseas deployment in Syria. You see a continuing trend of, if not more assertive, a much more active China, and a China that is moving not only from being highly active in Central Asia in the economic and infrastructure spaces, but a China that is increasingly becoming more active in the security space. You see the rise of ISIS, the movement of significant numbers of Central Asians to Syria to fight under the black flag, terrorist attacks being perpetrated by Central Asians up in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And then, of course, you always have the ongoing question of succession anxiety. So from a security forces standpoint, any one, or certainly any combination of these things, could be hypothesized to bring about a very significant sort of rethink in the security posture, structured security forces, focused security forces, rethinking of national strategies. And I think if you take a look at, and at least what I would argue in the book, is by and large, that really didn't take place. What you see is an awful lot of continuity. You see security forces that are still very much focused on internal threats first and foremost. You see international security space that Russia continues to dominate through the SCO, through the CSTO. You see each of the individual Central Asian states accommodating themselves to Russia and Russia's dominance of the security space in their own kind of unique ways, based upon their bilateral relationship, based upon the peculiarities of their geography. And you see an environment in which mutual suspicion really mitigates against collaboration and cooperation, and an environment in which most of the collaboration and cooperation in the space is done through the vehicle of international organizations that are usually conceived of and dominated by outside partners, whether it be NATO, SCO, CSTO, with the CSTO being sort of the primus inter pares. And I would say I'd be hard-pressed to argue that they're equal in that regard. And then you see an ongoing trend in which each of the countries in its own way is trying to diversify their basket of risk, and if not to diversify, at least dilute the dependence on Russia while they try to modernize their Soviet legacy forces. If you want to learn more, read the book.
While Terry's coming up, how was the hero of socialist labor? This is the heroine. And again, without her, this never would have taken place.
The way the book is structured, the first two sections we asked all of our authors to look at least two, but as many countries as they wanted in Central Asia, and look at a specific trend across those countries. And then in the last section of the book, we have case studies of each of the Central Asian republics in which we asked a scholar to look at one particular thing that's important in that country and talk about examining that in depth. And as you heard, Sophia took one of our case studies and took Turkmenistan. Rob was one of our comparatives and does a really nice job of comparing all 5 republics. I'm the political economy and infrastructure person, and I took the opportunity to examine what's changing in the political economy of Central Asia. And in looking at it and in looking at what's happening, for much of the strategic world right now, particularly in development, the story is about China and what China's building and the Belt and Road Initiative. For me, the story is about how is Central Asia changing the nature of their economies because of Chinese activity. And what I found in doing the research and doing the comparison is essentially for decades, the Central Asian states suffered enormously from being landlocked, which meant that until their neighbors got it together and until they had a certain level of confidence in their neighbors, trade was nearly impossible. And even though these states had commodities that were very valued by the world, only Russia seemed to know how to get the commodities out of there. What has happened in the past decade really is a story of finding a new Leviathan, if you will, with China not only investing but moderating the behavior of the states and increasing the volume of trade that goes across the states. The states are beginning to think a little bit differently about their neighbors, about the rules that govern trade and transit, because now it appears that there's actually opportunities to be gained by that trade and transit. And so the states are beginning to think very differently about the future. And so the comparative chapter I wrote for this book is about the emerging political economy, which historically was really just commodities and in many cases stranded commodities, and is now emerging to a space that is a mix of commodities and services. And the states, including Kazakhstan, which has enormous commodities, the states are beginning to see themselves as being very involved in transit, as transit being important. And the other thing that they're being increasingly involved in, which is a personal passion of my own, is electricity, which is actually a mix of commodity and service and requires a much higher level of interstate coordination if you're going to be trading in it. So my comparative case looked at that evolution of new political economies. I did the case study for Tajikistan, and I did it focusing on Rogun, the big hydropower project that's going in. And for Tajikistan, I looked at 3 different narratives, because when we try to understand Rogun, it's sort of explained 3 very different ways. The first way is as a vanity project of the leader himself. And Rahman, this has been a passion of his. He has intertwined his own legacy very profoundly with Rogun. A second way of looking at it is a continuance of a Soviet legacy, that Tajikistan understands itself so much as the state that gave electricity to the Soviet Union that they're sort of stuck on that path to dependence. And then the third thing is do they really need this? And in fact, we find evidence for all 3, but the extraordinary 2 pieces that I found in my research, and I find to be true in many places in the former Soviet Union. The first one is that for domestic political purposes, Rahman doesn't want to talk about his real problem. And his real problem just in electricity, he has many. His real problem in electricity is that the way the Soviet grid was designed, they built the dam in the middle before they built the dam on the end. And the way they built the dam in the middle, it's not a durable legacy unless you get to that dam on the end. And so what we're seeing all over the former Soviet space is nations are essentially trying to save the Soviet dam. If you don't build another one upstream, the one in the middle will no longer be serviceable within the 20-year future. And in fact, Rogun is fundamentally a project to save the one Narek dam that supplies the majority of power to Tajikistan in the present moment. So I look a little bit at that in my chapter. It's also certainly about prestige. Rahman wants to say, as his legacy, he wants to be able to say to the people, I brought you peace, I brought you light. Arguably, he has succeeded in bringing peace, negotiating the end of the Civil War. Bringing the nation of Tajikistan light is still something that hasn't happened yet. It is also still very much a part of the Soviet legacy, and the other thing I write about in this chapter is that Tajikistan currently produces none of the components that you need to make aluminum. They only contribute the electricity. And now as they envision their future and want to produce more electricity and more aluminum, they're trying to think about, can we mine some of it here? But in the Soviet past and all the way into the present, cheap electricity is the single most important component in aluminum. So Tajikistan is in the bizarre position, and this nests in my political economy of Central Asia position. They're aggressive importers of everything they need to export their principal commodity, which is a rather bizarre and extraordinary circumstance. But so that's what I've worked on, and I just want to say that one of the really fun things about this book is because so little is written about Central Asia as a whole, we didn't want to talk about just one of the stories of Central Asia. What we wanted to do was to entwine a lot of different themes. And there's some extraordinary stuff in here on social movements, on human rights, on communications, on energy, on infrastructure, on governance. But really what we wanted to tell is the story of a group of nations that, as Dan said, originally no one thought they'd make it this far. Now there's no question that there are 5 very sovereign states that will continue for a long time into the future. And so understanding the components of those states becomes our task as scholars and as policymakers.
Do we need to be at the podium for the cameras?
You do need to get the podium.
You've heard of Russian roulette, this is Russian scramble.
I am very grateful to be here for many reasons, not the least of which is my opportunity to wear my camisole that I got last year at the Bazaar. Actually, that is the least of the reasons that I'm glad to be here. I feel very honored to be part of this community of scholars, many of whom I have admired for a long time, and I'm happy to meet the others that I haven't known. I was really glad 5 years ago when Dan invited me to contribute, because at the time I was a media analyst, and this was not that long after the Arab Spring. I was getting a little frustrated with a couple of themes that I heard repeatedly. One was that social media in Central Asia wasn't really important from a political point of view. And I wanted to write something that demonstrated that that's simply not true. Social media has an important political role in Central Asia, in each of the countries, and it can be useful as a form of political analysis as well. The other thing that was frustrating me about the analysis of social media and the discussion of social media was that I could find no parsimonious and yet encompassing and productive theoretical approach to social media. And so what I've done in my chapter is I have gone out into the field of communication studies and taken some thoughts from there, tried to apply them to Central Asia, demonstrated the existence, growth of social media in Central Asia to begin with, compared it a little across countries, and then showed how it has been politically effective and important in each of the countries in different ways at different times. And do that within a theoretical schema that is not complicated. It's parsimonious, but it points us to looking at the actors, the people who are contributing to social media, who are consuming social media, and focuses on how it affects them. It's by no means a completed theoretical approach, but it points us, I think, in a useful direction. Before I sit down, I want to particularly express my appreciation to a number of people, Dan and Terry above all. They have worked so hard, so assiduously over this period, been tenacious and kind at the same time in gently encouraging us, bringing us authors along. It's been I've really appreciated it, including their patience when we maybe overlook a deadline. And how Tan has been so kind in his copy editing and all the work he has done. I have to thank my son, Jonathan, who was my first copy editor. He's not here today, but I told him I would mention him. And I especially want to thank my husband, Frank, who is here and has been an incredible support to me in helping me to pursue this interest in a region that, when I started, was very difficult to study. But he has supported me in studying it and through the process of getting this chapter done. I hope you enjoy the book.
while Comrade Laura makes her way up here, several of us are still affiliated with the government, so I'm going to make the blanket statement. All of these comments reflect only our personal views, not those of our agencies, the United States government, and especially the President of the United States.
Wow, what's Laura about to say?
So I'm Laura Adams, and I'm a USAID Democracy Fellow at the Institute of International Education, and thank you, Dan, for clarifying that. So I'm somebody who has always tried to give Uzbekistan the benefit of the doubt when it comes to civil society and governance issues. I have done this and am thankful for the opportunities I've had to collaborate with colleagues from Uzbekistan in applying different lenses of analysis to things that, for example, Western society would call sham civil society, gongos. I worked with a colleague looking at organized non-governmental organizations in Uzbekistan in the wonderful for civil society year of 2004. And we were trying to look at the degree to which these gongos actually served constituencies. And could we look at that as the function of civil society to ensure justice by representing constituent concerns? Well, it turned out, no, gongos only answer to the people above them that created them. So that was our attempt to give the benefit of the doubt to civil society. And then I had been, for the last few years, trying to give the benefit of the doubt to issues of corruption and governance. Uzbekistan is in some ways a fairly high capacity state. In what senses can we look at the state as having systems of governance that would not be recognized as good governance by Western democracies? And in this, I was fortunate to pair up with Rustamjan Urinboyev, a sociologist who's at Lund University's Sociology of Law faculty, and his advisor, Mats Svensson, who had recently been in Uzbekistan conducting fieldwork on what we ended up calling everyday governance in Uzbekistan. And we came together with a theoretical framework that I'd been developing based on Stephen Krasner's model of good enough governance, and looking at the ways that everyday life negotiations take place in some framework of informal governance that is not what we would normally think of. And we looked at particular case studies of what would normally be termed corruption to try and understand how these processes are negotiated, to what extent do they involve systems and requirements that people can anticipate in advance and be negotiated with some expectation that you know how this transaction is going to unfold. So there's a really interesting anecdote from the field work that Rustamjan and Mans did in Uzbekistan of a police officer, a traffic police officer. And what does it mean for him to have to sell tickets to people who violate the law? That's the phrase he uses. And then there's an interview with a midwife, for example, about the tradition and expected procedure of payment of a thank you gift on the successful delivery of a birth, and what does that mean within a system that people understand and know. So we tried to look at these different aspects of governance, an informal system of governance, and ask, is this in some sense good enough governance? Now, I think Dan and Terry would say 5 years is a really long time, but for Uzbekistan, 2 years, the past 2 years in particular, is a very long time. So I think it's very interesting to look at what we wrote in this chapter, and some of the very things that are highlighted about these everyday life governance issues are the things that the government of Uzbekistan has thrown open its electronic portals for citizens to discuss. So I think there's, keeping in mind the current reforms that the government is trying to implement, and the particular ways that this governance system worked before, I think it'll be very interesting to see the ways that the informal practices now merge into what may be a more formal and fair system of governance.
All PowerPoint slides ready?
I promised, I
Just
wouldn't say
kidding.
anything about deadlines.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I have to echo the kind words of my colleagues up here about the generosity in terms of time and space by our editors. So on that, and it's interesting because as part of this first test, the initial volume, and then doing an update rewrite for the second volume, it actually was quite a task, and it wasn't a case of, gee, let's just update it, but really rethink it. And that was the way I approached it in terms of the topic I looked at, which was actually legal frameworks and legal challenges or reforms in Central Asia. And I came at this really as someone from sort of two angles. One, as someone who actually is interested in law and institutions and those sorts of things, and in many ways it's the structure and framework, as Laura is talking about how people live their lives. Well, how are we actually constructing this? What are the institutions? What are the rights? What are the responsibilities? What is the concept of recourse? But then as we, outsiders, came into the region, particularly in the 1990s, with such enthusiasm to reform law, right? To make it look like ours, whether it was constitutional law, electoral laws, commercial laws, you name it. And of course what we found, and this really is more the gist of this current volume, looking back over 25 years, is we've seen a very curious amalgam of concepts of law, of how we interpret it, how we understand it. It's not just this, what I would call the philosophical or sort of discourse-focused approach, but also the structures. We have in the region an emphasis on, if you want to say, very traditional forms of law, someone who really spent more, early times looking at, history, and in fact the namesake of this, Tamerlane himself was instrumental in creating legal frameworks in the region. We have a Soviet era that we can't deny has influenced processes and influenced issues of responsibility. And then of course we have the post-Soviet period, which at some point maybe we'll look at the post-Soviet period, where a number of outsiders have tried to influence. And the discussion really is more about how these outside groups tried to influence, or at least shape how law is perceived in Central Asia. Looking at the 5 different countries, we really see 5 different models. We see different approaches to how this how this develops. And if there are some common themes, and I'll just kind of highlight this and leave it at that, is you see a rather curious mix. And as I say, it's an amalgam of Western discourse, but justifications based on frameworks that come from Russia, from China, from other states, that justify, state control, that justify limited individual rights. Not saying that this is a good or bad thing, it's simply how does one approach rights and responsibilities in society? How does one approach political opportunities, political rights, political responsibilities? What are the roles for companies, corporations, etc.? All of these really are, if you want to say, works in progress, even after so many years, because quite frankly, in every country, these are works in progress, not just in Central Asia, but in the US, in Russia, in China, in Belarus, in France, you name it. We're constantly reevaluating the boundaries of individuals and the boundaries of states. And so the Central Asians are working through this. It's, as I said, it was a wonderful project to work on, and it took me away from, if you want to say, the day-to-day life of at the Near East South Asia Center, where I'm busily trying to work on programs in the region and doing things that I call more tactical level. It's nice to sit back and think a bit more philosophically. So enjoy reading it, and if you need a nap, it's also good.
I was asked to write a chapter on Kazakhstan foreign policy, but because I was tired of discussing always the kind of triangle between Russia, China, and the West, and readers are also tired of reading things about that, I decided to look at the tensions between Kazakhstan promoting Central Asian integration and Kazakhstan promoting Eurasian integration, and the kind of both tension and overlap that the two directions can have. So the Kazakh authorities always said they were promoting both. In reality, of course, in practice, concretely, Central Asian integration was very limited because of the difficult relationship with Uzbekistan at that time, and Eurasian integration got promoted because Russia was also pushing for it. So the narrative coming from the Kazakh state were both are important, but in reality, one became practically implemented, the second stayed on the paper. What happened, the result of that was that Astana suddenly found itself caught in a kind of contradiction around the way it was promoting Eurasian integration. For years, Kazakhstan used the term Eurasia as a way to describe its multivectoral policy. But then, once Russia took over the narrative of Eurasia with the Eurasian Economic Union, and then after with the Ukrainian crisis, suddenly Eurasia took a kind of Russian-centric color, a kind of symbol of Russia's domination over the post-Soviet region that Kazakhstan couldn't play anymore as being its kind of symbol of multivectoralism. So that's something that I'm looking at in the chapter, and of course things have changed now since Uzbekistan, now under Mirziyoyev, is kind of going back to discussing regional integration, and at the same time the Eurasian integration finds itself slowed down both by countries around Russia and in a sense by Russia itself also. So in a sense there is a kind of rebalancing moment now where suddenly Eurasian integration seems not very giving a lot of perspective, and Central Asian integration seems once again possible on the table, so it's kind of reopening the dynamic between these two tensions. I'm also looking in the chapter at Kazakhstan's ambivalent attraction for having a specific path that would be neither Eurasian integration nor Central Asian integration, and this dilemma of saying at the same time that Kazakhstan is the leading country for the stance region, and at the same time it doesn't want really to be a stance because it doesn't sound so good. And so there have been several interesting initiatives taken, and it's not done by Kazakh marginal nationalists, it was done by Nazarbayev himself and by Dariga also, of discussing the possibility of Kazakhstan changing its name and abolishing the stan to become Kazakh Yeli, the country of the Kazakhs. And so I'm looking at all these attempts of discussing what would that mean for Kazakhstan to change its name and not be a stan anymore. There have been really interesting comparison elements brought by Nazarbayev himself about Mongolia as being a model of how just to be one country by itself alone without belonging to a region. Also interesting comparison with Singapore and Malaysia as possible paths of development for Kazakhstan. And so I'm looking at all the kind of the underlying cultural element that this Kazakh Yeli path would mean for Kazakhstan, especially how much it would change the relationship to Islam, because I think what is kind of underlying is the potential refusal of the stan notion. It's something also related to Islam or to something interpreted as too radical Islam. But it also creates a lot of other issues because it would force Kazakhstan to kind of push away the Turkestani heritage and shift toward a more steppe world, but in a sense focusing more toward this steppe world, and this kind of Siberian one would push also back to Russia. So it's a kind of difficult dilemma that Kazakhstan has to face. So I'm looking at these three elements, the relationship to Central Asian integration, the kind of shift in the way Kazakhstan can use Eurasia integration because of Russia's own strategy, and the discussion around the possibility of Kazakhstan as having its own unique path in the region. Thank you.
Last and certainly least, yours truly, my chapter was entitled Great Game Changers, the Changing Nature of Central Asian Energy. And anytime we talk about energy, I'm always reminded of the words of Dan Yergin. The problem with writing about energy these days is it changes so quickly. And of course, as soon as the chapter came out, we actually now at least have a little period of stability with rising gas prices, but we'll see what happens there. 2/3 of the chapter we're going to write off because it gives the background and then a quick analysis of the three countries. What I'd like to focus on is what the chapter was meant to look at, which is what are the potential game changers that could, in short notice, disrupt energy in Central Asia. And all of you know Central Asia is the underpinning in one form or another of all of these countries. And came up with three. First of all, the state of the world economy, very simple. Adam Smith, if the world economy is down, energy requirements are down, and that's going to affect all of these countries. If, on the other hand, as we're seeing right now, world economy is picking up a little better than people expected, that's going to increase the demand, that's going to change the dynamic of what takes place. But there are other factors than pure economics. The next is technology, and especially shale energy, which has introduced technological uncertainty into energy markets. And the key example here is, while Russia and Saudi Arabia may have agreed to suppress production, which in turn raises prices, if prices go too high, the United States turns on all of that technology we invested in shale energy, floods the market, and prices go back down again. So there is a balance here. Point being, 10 years ago, very few people were talking about shale energy and recovery of those assets. So that's another game changer. Who knows what may happen in the next 10 years that will affect the energy markets. And finally, the Ukraine factor, political uncertainty. Events of 2014 rewrote the script in terms of our relations with Russia and then in turn with the countries at the near abroad. And we're still trying to sort out all of those dynamics. But as a result of those events, we have sanctions against Russia that has had other impacts and trickle-down effect. So one of the, normally you'll have a conclusion at the end of a chapter. I don't have any conclusions because right now we just don't know. But we know what the factors are. And if we follow those factors in the future, depending which ones come into the fore, that will probably drive the nature of energy in Central Asia. One interesting little coda to this is at the same time we see most of the world becoming, how shall we say, more centered on their individuals and a decline in globalization writ large. Central Asia all of a sudden seems to have discovered the benefits of cooperation. And we've seen that because of events in Uzbekistan, a number of factors. China working with the One Belt, One Road initiative, you have to have cooperation there. But it seems, even though we're talking about the Central Asian states in the era of sovereignty, to a surprising degree, they've been willing, not to give up their sovereignty, but to bend a little bit in order to achieve the benefits of cooperation within the region. And that could be something interesting to watch in the near future. I'm going to save the last words for Terry because she does a magnificent job of summarizing a lot of different thoughts.
No pressure there. The thing that makes this made this book fun to work on is that there are so many different threads to explore. It's not a book that looks at political economy or that looks at social trends. It's a book that makes an effort to take the scholarship and some of the lead scholars out there and look at all these things. But there is one sort of thread that I think that does bind the book together, and I really encourage you to think about it this way. It's an exploration of how these nations have become distinct and solid. This reference to what is post-Soviet. I think this book is starting to get us to where we look at what's similar and different about the five countries. What are the connections they're pursuing, and what are the connections they find inescapable, and how is that changing? And it was a real pleasure to have this really forum opportunity to bring together a lot of scholarship. We do have Central Asian scholars, we have a lot of emerging scholars, and then we have some of us who have been doing this for a long time, all working together, and it was a lot of fun. It was not always.
Sometimes.
But the ideas were a lot of fun. And there is one other person that I do want to recognize who gave us a wonderful assist, and that's Gawdat. Gawdat Bahgat is one of our colleagues from MDU, and he did a couple of things for us. One was, before you can release a book, when so many of us are government employees, you have to have some folks who review it carefully and give a review to make sure that you haven't inadvertently said anything that you cannot say. And Gawdat not only was willing to do that, he did it and gave us commentary and critique on the book itself, as well as just making sure that we could get through all the hoops. And it was wonderful to have a colleague and an expert on the region who was willing to do that for us. So thank you for that, Gawdat. Otherwise, I think we've got a little bit of time to answer people's questions or to
Yep.